The sky over the Solomon Islands is a maelstrom of chaos. Lieutenant Jack "Jax" Riley grips his controls, the twin engines of his P-38 Lightning screaming as he banks hard. Tracers, bright and deadly, stitch the air around him, but something is wrong. The attacking fighter, another P-38, has the same silhouette, the same powerful roar. It's an American plane. Jax's voice crackles over the radio, a mix of disbelief and terror. "Blue leader, they're one of ours. Cease fire, for God's sake. You're firing on your own men." The response is a fresh burst of cannon fire that rips through his wingman's tail. As smoke billows and a friendly plane spirals toward the turquoise water below, Jax realizes the horrifying truth. The enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was themselves. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The briefing room at Henderson Field was a study in oppressive humidity. It was 1943, and on Guadalcanal, the air itself felt like a wet blanket, thick with the smells of damp canvas, nervous sweat, and the lingering bitterness of yesterday's coffee. Maps of the Solomon Islands, their edges curled from the moisture, were pinned to a rough wooden board that served as the squadron's strategic heart. Here, in this makeshift sanctuary from the Pacific sun, a group of young men in flight suits listened to the gravelly voice of their leader. Major Vincent "Vince" Carter stood before them, a man whose face was a roadmap of past campaigns, his eyes holding a seriousness that commanded respect. He was weathered, pragmatic, and had seen far too many fresh-faced pilots go from cocksure to memorialized in the span of a single mission. "All right, listen up," Major Carter began, his voice cutting through the low buzz of anxious energy. "Today's mission is a bomber escort. We'll be taking the birds up to 25,000 feet, providing cover for a flight of B-17s hitting a supply depot on Bougainville. Standard procedure, but command has intel that we can expect heavy resistance." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room, lingering for a moment on the two youngest pilots in the squadron. Intel also suggests we might run into an ace they're calling the Shadow, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka. He's credited with over 24 kills. He's smart, he's patient, and he's deadly. He doesn't attack until he has the advantage. One of the pilots, Lieutenant Jack "Jax" Riley, shifted in his wooden chair. He was a top graduate from flight school, brimming with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He loved his P-38 Lightning with a passion that others reserved for sweethearts back home, and he was convinced it was the most formidable fighting machine in the sky. He was itching for a real dogfight, a chance to prove that his skills and his aircraft were more than just a match for the vaunted Japanese Zeros. Beside him, his wingman, Lieutenant Benny Carter, was a stark contrast. More reserved and deeply analytical, Benny respected the P-38, but was acutely aware of its limitations, particularly its sluggish turning radius at low speeds and altitudes, a weakness the nimble Zeros were expert at exploiting. Major Carter tapped a silhouette of their own plane on the board. "The P-38 is a thoroughbred. You have speed, you have unmatched firepower, and you have performance at high altitude where the Zero's engine starts to gasp. That is your advantage. Use it." His tone hardened. "But I want to be crystal clear. The Japanese pilots are masters of the close quarters turning fight. If you let them draw you into a low-speed dogfight, they will get on your tail and they will put you in the ground. Your advantage is in the dive, the boom and zoom. Hit them hard and fast, then use your speed to climb away and set up your next pass. Do not, under any circumstances, get into a turning fight with them. Stick to the plan." As the major continued, Jax leaned over to Benny, his voice a low, confident murmur that was just for them. "Let them try to turn, we'll be a mile above them before they know what hit them. This fork-tailed devil is a game changer." Benny nodded, but his expression remained tight, his analytical mind already calculating the risks, running through the scenarios where things could go horribly wrong. The room was a pressure cooker of emotions, a volatile mix of Jax's youthful bravado, Benny's quiet apprehension, and the bone-deep weariness of a veteran commander like Carter. The oppressive heat and the gravity of the mission ahead hung over them all, a tense, unspoken weight. High above the Pacific, the world was a brilliant, searing blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds that looked solid enough to walk on. Below, the formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned on, a tight, disciplined phalanx of American air power, Flying escort in their P-38 Lightnings, Jax felt a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. This was it. This was what he had trained for, dreamed of. His hands were steady on the controls, his eyes constantly scanning the vast emptiness of the sky, searching for the specks that would signal the start of the dance. Benny was glued to his wing, a silent, watchful presence. Then they appeared, tiny black dots in the distance, growing with terrifying speed. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, from the cockpit of his A6M-0, observed the strange, twin-boomed American fighters for the first time. He had heard whispers of this new aircraft, but seeing it now, it looked clumsy, heavy. His lips curled into a dismissive sneer. He saw them not as fighters, but as lumbering twin-engine bombers, absurdly miscast in the role of interceptors. This would be easy. He signaled his pilots to engage, his strategy simple and proven. Lure the heavy American planes into a turning dogfight, where his Zeros, light and agile as dragonflies, would be supreme. The Zeros peeled off and dived, a swarm of angry hornets descending on the formation. But the P-38s didn't take the bait. Following Major Carter's orders to the letter, they held their altitude, waiting. As the Zeros swept past, the American fighters nosed over, diving with a speed that shocked the Japanese pilots. The P-38s were hunters, not brawlers. Jax felt the G-forces press him into his seat as his Lightning screamed downwards. He lined up a Zero in his sights, the crosshairs of his gun sight settling on the enemy aircraft. He squeezed the trigger. The nose of his plane erupted in a torrent of fire. The percussive thump, thump, thump of his .450 caliber machine guns and the deeper roar of his 20mm cannon creating a deafening crescendo. The concentrated stream of lead tore into the Zero, which seemed to simply disintegrate, blossoming into a ball of orange flame and black smoke. The power was intoxicating, a visceral, exhilarating confirmation of everything he believed about his plane. Kenji Tanaka watched in stunned disbelief as one of his best men vanished from the sky. The speed of the American fighter was astonishing, its firepower overwhelming. He banked hard, trying to engage the P-38 that had claimed his pilot, but it was useless. Jax's Lightning, its dive converted back into momentum, simply outran him in a shallow climb, pulling away with an ease that felt like an insult. Tanaka was a master of the sky, a duelist who prided himself on his skill and precision. This new enemy, this fork-tailed devil, fought with brute force. It was a hammer, not a sword. The blinding sun glinted off Jax's canopy as he climbed away, leaving Tanaka alone in the empty blue sky. The beautiful yet terrifying image of his comrade's plane breaking apart in midair burned into his memory. The initial thrill of the fight for Jax was now tempered by the cold, hard reality of air combat. For Tanaka, his dismissiveness had evaporated, replaced by a grudging, hateful respect for the new enemy aircraft. Back at Henderson Field, the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the runway. The mood was far more somber than it had been that morning. The squadron had been successful, repelling the attack and ensuring the bombers reached their target. But the victory was not without cost. One pilot, a young man who had let his aggression get the better of him, had broken formation and allowed himself to be drawn into a turning fight. He never came back. While the other pilots clapped Jax on the back, celebrating his first confirmed kill, Major Carter's praise was reserved. He drew Jax aside, his expression grim. "One kill doesn't win a war, Lieutenant," Carter said, his voice low and firm. "Discipline does. The pilot we lost today forgot that. He got cocky, thought he could outfly a Zero in its own element. Don't you make the same mistake." "Yes, sir," Jax replied, his earlier elation fading under the weight of his commander's words. "But you have to admit, they never saw it coming. They thought we were slow. They were wrong." Carter nodded slowly. They were. And now they know. They'll adapt. Tanaka is too smart not to. Next time will be harder. Later, as the mechanics swarmed over the planes, patching bullet holes and refueling, Jax stood with Benny, looking out at the darkening horizon. The initial euphoria of victory had completely given way to the sobering reality of their loss. Benny, who had watched the whole thing unfold from Jax's wing, was still shaken. "It happened so fast, Jax," he said, his voice barely a whisper. One minute he was there, talking on the radio, and the next, just smoke and a long fall to the water. Jax didn't have an answer. He could still feel the shudder of his cannons, still see the Zero exploding in his sights. But now, that image was paired with the memory of a fellow pilot's empty seat at the debrief. As they stood there, another pilot walked past, talking with his ground crew. "Saw the Jokers on our way back," the pilot mentioned, referring to another P-38 squadron that flew out of a neighboring airstrip. "Flew right over their patrol route. Funny thing, from a distance, with the sun in your eyes, their formation looked just like ours, but mirrored. Gave me a start for a second." The comment was casual, an idle observation, but it hung in the air, a mirrored formation, an identical silhouette. In the glare of the Pacific sun, where distances were deceptive and the sky could play tricks on the eyes, it was a detail that seemed insignificant. But it was a seed of confusion, planted in the fertile ground of combat fatigue and the ever-present tension of war. Jax's confidence in his fork-tailed devil was no longer absolute. It was now tempered with a dose of harsh reality and a new, unsettling thought, a tiny splinter of anxiety that he couldn't quite name. The sky, which had felt like his playground just hours before, now seemed to hold a new, more insidious kind of danger. On a captured island airbase, the mood was the antithesis of the weary relief at Henderson Field. Here, under the stark, disciplined order of the rising sun, the air was thick with a tense, analytical fury. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka stood before a board of senior officers, his face a mask of controlled intensity. The dismissive arrogance he had felt upon first seeing the American P-38s was gone, burned away in the fire that had consumed his wingman. In its place was a cold, intellectual obsession. He was debriefing his superiors, his voice steady as he described the aircraft that had so thoroughly shattered their tactics. He gave it the name they had all started using, a name born of grudging respect and a touch of superstitious fear, Mekurabe, the two-headed demon. He argued with a passion that bordered on insubordination that their traditional methods were not just failing, they were suicidal against this new threat. The P-38 was not a dogfighter, in any sense they understood. It did not engage in the elegant, swirling duels of honor and skill that the Zero pilots had perfected. It was a hunter. It dictated the terms of every engagement, using its phenomenal speed and high-altitude performance to strike from above and then vanish, leaving only destruction in its wake. He proposed a radical shift in their approach. They had to stop trying to force the P-38 into their fight and instead create conditions where it was forced to fight like a Zero. He outlined a new strategy of coordinated high-altitude ambushes, using a decoy force to draw the Lightnings down, to bleed off their speed and energy, and to trap them at lower altitudes where the Zero's superior agility could finally be brought to bear. In his own mind, Tanaka was no longer just fighting a machine. He was fighting a philosophy. He saw the P-38 as a dishonorable weapon, a vulgar instrument of brute force that eschewed the artistry and skill he held so dear. It was a creation of an industrial behemoth that valued power over precision, a hammer in a world of swords. This conviction did not lead him to despair. It fueled his determination. He would find its weakness. He would be the water that flows around the rock, the patient strategist who outwits the barbarian's club. "We cannot fight it as we fight the wildcat," he concluded, his eyes burning with a dark fire. "It is not a sword, it is a hammer. We must be the water that flows around the rock, not the stone that breaks against it." The officers listened, their expressions grim. The two-headed demon had changed the calculus of the war in the Pacific, and the Japanese pilots, now wary and deeply respectful of their new adversary, were becoming a far more dangerous foe. Days later, the sky itself seemed to conspire against the Americans. A high, thin layer of clouds stretched across the horizon, a milky film that diffused the harsh Pacific sun, creating a disorienting, hazy glare. Light played tricks, distances became impossible to judge, and familiar shapes took on strange, distorted qualities. It was in this treacherous environment that Blue Squadron, led by Major Carter with Jax and Benny on his wings, was returning from a long, uneventful patrol. At the same time, another P-38 squadron, the Joker Squadron, was heading out on their own patrol route. Their courses were set to intersect. Joker Squadron was led by a hard-nosed pilot named Frankie Gallo, a man known for his aggressive tactics and a gut instinct approach to combat that sometimes bordered on reckless. As his squadron climbed through the hazy air, he spotted a group of fighters emerging from the glare. They were twin-tailed, just like his own planes, but the angle was odd, the formation unfamiliar. His radio, already crackling with the atmospheric static common to the region, offered no clarity. He had been briefed, as had all pilots, to be on the lookout for new and experimental Japanese aircraft. Whispers of German engineers helping them develop new designs. In the deceptive light, the approaching P-38s, with their unique and still somewhat alien silhouette, looked wrong. His gut, honed by dozens of missions, screamed trap. "Joker lead, you getting a look at these guys?" His wingman's voice crackled over the intercom. "Are those friendlies?" Frankie stared, his eyes straining against the sun. The formation wasn't on their flight plan for this sector. They were coming from a direction that didn't make sense. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a tiny window of doubt, but the aggressive instinct that had kept him alive this long took over. It was a command decision, and in the sky, hesitation was death. "They're not on our flight plan," he broadcast, his voice tight and decisive. "Assume hostile. Weapons free." With a chilling efficiency, Joker Squadron banked as one, turning to attack their own. From Jax's perspective, the maneuver was baffling. He saw the other P-38s, their markings still indistinct in the haze, turning towards them aggressively. He assumed it was a joke, a bit of hot dogging from the notoriously cocky Jokers. A flash of annoyance went through him. "Hey, Jokers, easy on the throttle," he quipped over the radio, his tone light and mocking. "Save some for the Zeros." The response was not a friendly waggle of the wings. Benny's voice, suddenly sharp with alarm, cut through Jax's casual annoyance. "Jax, they're arming their guns. I see the lights." Jax's blood ran cold. He squinted, and Benny was right. The small, bright lights on the leading edges of the approaching P-38 its wings were illuminated, signaling their guns were charged and ready. It was impossible. It made no sense. But the visual evidence was undeniable. On his own squadron's channel, Frankie Gallo's voice was a sharp, urgent command, filled with the adrenaline of the attack. "Engage! Engage! Don't let them get away!" The disorienting glare of the sun, the sudden, terrifying realization that the planes bearing down on them were not friends, but aggressors, and the confused crackle over the radio channels all coalesced into a single moment of pure, unadulterated panic. The breakdown of trust and communication was instantaneous and absolute. Frankie's squadron opened fire. A stream of tracers, bright red lines of death, sliced through the air between the two formations. The shots were wide, more of a warning volley than a killing blow, born perhaps of a final, subconscious flicker of doubt in the attacking pilots' minds. But the intent was terrifyingly clear. The sky, which had been empty and calm moments before, was now a web of deadly light. Just as Jax and the other Blue Squadron pilots instinctively broke formation, their minds struggling to process the unthinkable, a new voice cut through the chaos. It was Major Carter, his tone radiating an authority that sliced through the panic and static. He was broadcasting on the emergency frequency, his voice a lifeline in the madness. "All Allied fighters, this is Blue Leader. Cease fire. You are engaging friendly P-38s. I repeat, stand down." The firing stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The tracers vanished. A tense, profound silence descended, broken only by the roar of 32 engines. The two squadrons passed each other, close enough for the pilots to see the shocked and confused faces in the opposing cockpits. No one spoke. The air hung thick with a mixture of shame, anger, and disbelief. It was an awkward, terrifying moment of reckoning in the empty sky. Back at Henderson Field, the debrief was explosive. The humid briefing room, once a place of camaraderie, now felt like a courtroom. Frankie Gallo, his face pale under his tan, was defensive, almost belligerent. He insisted the formation had looked wrong, that their angle of approach was hostile, that in the heat of the moment, he had made the only call he could. Jax, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely control, was on his feet, shouting, "They were flying P-38s, for God's sake. What did you think they were?" Major Carter, his face a grim mask of stone, finally slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "Enough!" The room fell silent. The incident was officially logged as a misidentification due to atmospheric conditions. It was a sterile, bureaucratic phrase that did nothing to capture the terror and the fury of the event. But the incident, though it had ended without bloodshed, left a deep and lasting psychological scar on every pilot involved. The sky, their home, and their battlefield no longer felt safe. The very thing that made their aircraft unique, the distinctive twin boom silhouette that had so intimidated the Japanese, was now a source of deep, gnawing anxiety. Later, Jack sat on the edge of his cot, the image of the other P-38s guns flashing replaying endlessly in his mind. He had always believed in his aircraft with an almost religious fervor. It was the best, the fastest, the most powerful. That absolute certainty was gone, shattered in a hail of friendly fire. In its place was a new, nagging fear, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. What if Major Carter hadn't been there to cut through the chaos? What if their aim hadn't been wide? He looked over at Benny, who was quietly cleaning his service pistol, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate precision that did nothing to hide their trembling. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, a ghost that would now follow them into the sky on every mission. They had a new enemy to worry about, an enemy that wore their own uniform and flew the same plane. They had to worry about themselves. This complication, this insidious seed of doubt, had raised the stakes of their war in a way none of them could have ever imagined. The fork, tail devil now had a mirrored image, and telling the difference could mean life or death. The perfect storm had been brewing for days. It broke over the Solomon Sea in a fury of fire and steel. A massive formation of American B-17 bombers, lumbering giants on a mission to cripple the Japanese war machine, found themselves swarmed by a vengeful cloud of Zeros. Leading the attack was Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, his earlier caution now honed into a razor-sharp plan. He had laid his trap with meticulous patience, positioning a high-altitude squadron of his best pilots to wait, hidden in the glare of the sun, ready to ambush the American fighters he knew would come. On the ground, the call had been scrambled. Both Blue Squadron and Joker Squadron were thrown into the sky, their powerful twin engines roaring to life. They climbed with desperate speed, two separate flights of fork, tailed devils converging on the same point of chaos from different directions. The radio, which should have been their lifeline of coordination, was a nightmare. It was a cacophony of overlapping calls, the shriek of pilots in their death throes, the desperate warnings of gunners, and the overwhelming hiss of static. Coherent communication was impossible. It was every man for himself. Frankie Gallo led Joker Squadron into the fray, diving from the west. His nerves, already frayed thin from the near-miss incident weeks before, were stretched to the breaking point. The sky was a three-dimensional canvas of madness, crisscrossing smoke trails, the bright flashes of cannon fire, and the dark shapes of planes twisting and falling. At the same time, Jax's squadron, having spotted and skillfully evaded Tanaka's high-altitude trap, circled around the main furball. They came in from the east, their entire formation perfectly silhouetted against the blinding, malevolent eye of the morning sun. For Frankie, it was a vision from his worst nightmares. His mind, saturated with adrenaline and fear, saw only what it was primed to see. He saw a group of twin boomed fighters banking hard out of the sun, their features washed out, their markings invisible in the blinding glare. They were in the perfect position for a flanking attack. The memory of the last incident, the feeling of being ambushed, the official reprimand, and the lingering corrosive doubt all fused into a single, terrible certainty. His mind didn't see fellow Americans. It saw the mirrored devil. It saw a trap. He screamed into his radio, his voice raw with a conviction born of terror. "Bandits! Bandits! 6 o'clock high! They're on our tail!" His squadron, trusting their leader's frantic call, their own eyes blinded by the same sun, reacted with the brutal efficiency of trained killers. Believing they were about to be annihilated from behind, they broke hard, turned, and opened fire on Jax's squadron. Jax watched it happen with a sense of surreal, slow motion horror. One moment he was lining up a Zero that was chewing on the tail of a B-17. The next he saw the familiar shapes of other P-38s turning on them, their wings erupting in flashes of orange light. For a split second, his mind refused to process it. It was a mistake, a terrible, impossible mistake. He saw one of Frankie's planes, guns blazing, line up perfectly on Benny's tail. Benny, his loyal wingman, his friend, who was calmly calling out enemy positions just a second before. "Frankie, no!" The words were a strangled scream, torn from Jax's throat, a desperate, useless plea into a radio already choked with the sounds of battle. "It's us. It's Benny." The message was swallowed by the static, a ghost of a voice lost in the storm. He saw the tracers, like fiery red fingers, reach out and touch Benny's plane. He saw the right engine nacelle disintegrate, chunks of metal shearing off into the slipstream. The P-38 didn't explode in a dramatic fireball. It was worse. It shuddered violently, a mortal wound delivered to its heart. A plume of thick black smoke began to pour from the shattered engine, and the plane, one wing heavy and dying, began a slow, graceful, fatal spiral towards the glittering blue water thousands of feet below. The fighting seemed to momentarily pause for Jax, the chaos of the sky fading into a muffled roar. All he could see was Benny's plane, not falling, but descending like a wounded bird, a long, dark scar of smoke tracing its path against the brilliant sky. Then, a new voice cut through the noise, a voice devoid of aggression, of adrenaline, of anything but a hollow, soul-crushing emptiness. It was Frankie. He had seen the plane go down. As it turned in its death spiral, the sun had caught the American star on its wing, the blue and white insignia suddenly, horribly clear. He saw what he had done. "Oh my God!" His voice whispered over the channel, a sound so faint it was almost lost, yet so filled with despair it seemed to scream. "What have I done?" It was a moment of absolute horror, of total distraction. And in the brutal calculus of air combat, a moment of distraction is an invitation to death. Kenji Tanaka, who had been watching the bizarre, unbelievable spectacle of the two headed demons fighting each other, saw his opening. His obsession had been with finding a weakness in the machine, but here he had been handed a weakness in the men who flew them. With the cold, detached precision of a master predator, he nosed his Zero over and dived directly onto Frankie Gallo's tail. A part of Jax wanted to let it happen. A dark, vengeful part of him wanted to watch Frankie pay the ultimate price for his mistake. But it was only a flicker. His grief, his horror, his rage, all coalesced into a single point of cold, pure fury. His hands and feet moved on their own, an act of pure, unthinking instinct. He broke off his helpless watch over Benny's falling plane, wrenched his P-38 into a hard, screaming turn that pushed the airframe to its limits, and went after Tanaka. He saved Frankie's life, not out of forgiveness, but because his rage needed a target, and the true enemy was now in his sights. The two aces, Jax and Tanaka, the young American hotshot and the veteran Japanese master, finally had their one-on-one duel. But it was not a contest of skill or sport. It was a clash fueled by tragedy, and a grief so profound it had become a weapon. Hours later, the sun set on Henderson Field, but its warmth brought no comfort. A heavy, oppressive silence had fallen over the airfield, a silence that was deeper and more profound than the mere absence of engine noise. It was the silence of grief, of shock, of a loss that felt different from all the others. Benny was confirmed killed in action. His plane had been seen hitting the water. There was no parachute. The words were clinical, but they landed like hammer blows. Jack sat on the ground, his back resting against the cool metal of his P-38's landing gear. He stared at a small, insignificant dent on the leading edge of his wing, a tiny pockmark left by a stray .50 caliber round, a friendly round. He stared at it for hours, his mind numb, replaying the moment over and over, the smoke, the spiral, the silence on the radio where Benny's voice should have been. Frankie Gallo was under informal arrest, confined to his tent, waiting for the inevitable board of inquiry. Pilots who saw him said he was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of the cocky, aggressive leader he had been that morning. He just sat on his cot, staring at his hands, the hands that had pulled the trigger. He was a broken man, shattered by a guilt that would be his lifelong wingman. Major Carter found Jax still by his plane, long after darkness had fallen. The Major was carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to Jax and sat down on the ground beside him, the silence stretching between them. Carter didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say Benny was in a better place or that he had died a hero. He knew those words were empty, useless insults to the raw wound of Jax's grief. Instead, he talked about the hard, brutal lessons of war. "We can't let this happen again," Carter said finally, his voice low and gravelly. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the distant star-dusted horizon. His death has to mean something, son. It can't just be another name on a list. It has to change something. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. High Command has been notified. This, and other near-miss incidents across the theater, they've finally pushed it to the top. They've issued a new directive. Carter looked at Jax, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. All P-38s in the Pacific are to be repainted, effective immediately. Their tails, the booms, and the wingtips are to be painted with high-visibility black and white stripes, invasion stripes. They're also fast, tracking new IFF transponders, identification friend or foe radios. A plane gets painted by your gun sight, you get a signal back, a clear, unambiguous signal, friend or nothing. He put a hand on Jax's shoulder. It's going to mean that no other pilot has to wonder if the plane on his 6 is one of his own. We'll paint them. We'll make them so bright a blind man could see they're ours. That's what Benny's death is going to mean. Weeks later, Jax was leading a patrol over the same stretch of ocean. The sky was the same brilliant, unforgiving blue. The sea below was the same turquoise expanse. But everything was different. He looked out at his wing, at the bold, unmistakable black and white stripes that now adorned its tip. They were a scar. They were a memorial, painted on the skin of every P-38 in the sky. They were Benny's stripes. In the distance, another squadron of Lightnings appeared, flying a reciprocal course. For a heartbeat, the old anxiety, the muscle memory of fear, tightened its grip on Jax's stomach. But then he saw them. The stripes, clear, stark, and unambiguous even from miles away. They were a sign, a password written in paint. Friend. The knot in his stomach didn't just loosen, it dissolved. The fear of the mirrored devil was gone. He looked at the new stripes on his wing again. The P-38 was no longer just a weapon of brute force, a hammer to be wielded against the enemy. It was now a symbol of a painful, hard-won wisdom, a lesson learned in blood and paid for with the life of his friend. The sky was still dangerous, the enemy was still cunning, but that specific insidious fear, the fear of themselves, had been banished. As his squadron, newly painted and forever changed, turned and flew into the setting sun, Jax Riley understood. The fork-tailed devil had finally learned to recognize its own reflection. And in that recognition, countless lives would be saved. It was a brutal price for wisdom, but it was a price that had been paid in full.